All right, we're diving into chapter 13. And this is dealing with the spinal cord, right? The information highway rolling through your back that connects your brain with your lower body. There are a couple of significant functions. By the way, this might look like a reasonable amount of stuff, but I made it bigger. Like I didn't squish it all together this time. So it really was only one page and like 2 lines. So rather than do that, I spread it out so it's a little bit bigger. But it's not a ton of stuff.
Thank you.
Yes, well again, because Friday is our assessment. So here's some functions. Some functions of the spinal cord, what it does. The first one is conduction, which is just kind of a duh, right? It's sending messages from below up to the brain, as well as information from the brain back down to the body. So both, what are those two things called? Going up is called what? The sensory, and coming down is the motor. Good, you know these for tomorrow, right? The second is the neural integration. So, are you comfortable that there are many different pieces that all come together into your brain, and the brain has to take and integrate this stuff and figure it, not like calculus, though actually kind of similar to calculus, where you are taking lots of inputs and you are making a meaning behind this and determining what kind of output should come. So that's what we mean by integration. All of these different nerves coming together and the brain, spinal cord having to figure out, okay, what's important, what goes where, what should we do? Our third piece is locomotion. A spinal cord contains central pattern generators. Did you know this repetitive sequence of us walking is something you don't have to consciously think about? For most of us. We just do it. Once we've learned it, which again, that's a process that we go through as a little baby. Once you've learned that, your body is just a pattern of movement that you go through, right? The same thing with these dancers. I've always been so impressed because I cannot dance at all. I'm a big, tall, ugly white guy. I cannot dance, okay? So I'm always impressed by these folks who can, and the way that they move their bodies. It's a pattern. It is a control that I just don't have. Okay, I can play sports, okay, but it's very sad. Our last but not least is reflexes. There is an unconscious control of posture, of your motor movements, the coordination there, as well as protective responses that your spinal cord does, not your brain. It doesn't even get to your brain. Again, when you put your hand down on a nice hot stove, you don't want the signal to have to go all the way to your brain. The brain say, I think my hand is literally on fire, and send back to, hey, you should move it. No, we want an immediate response that doesn't even go to the brain. That's what a reflex is. We'll talk more about these. Okay, so these are the 4 big functions of our spinal cord. Some surface anatomy pieces for you to be comfortable with. The spinal cord is basically the cylinder of nervous tissue that comes from the brainstem at the foramen magnum. You remember this? The big hole at the bottom of your skull, right? Moving down, and it goes through the upper 2/3. Did you realize that it ends at L1? So about here is where your spinal cord ends. Okay? And this cauda equina moves down further from there. The conus medullaris and the cauda equina. And it gives rise to the spinal nerves. It's not very big, right? About less than 2 centimeters thick. So really not big at all. Less than an inch in size. You looked yesterday at our spinal cord that we had in the microscope. And again, we're not zooming out or zooming in. That's the size of it, right? It's not very big at all. There are lots of grooves on the anterior and posterior surfaces. You learned about those yesterday in the lab piece that we did. I'm not looking for you to know all of those pieces. There is a cervical, a thoracic, a lumbar, and a sacral sections of the spinal cord, just like you had the same sections of your vertebrae. There are 2 enlargements at the cervical and the lumbar area, and that's because you got to produce all the nerves for your hands in the cervical one, and all the nerves for your legs and arms too up here in the cervical, and all the nerves for your legs in the lumbar. Does that make sense? It's basically more stuff's coming out and going in, so the cord gets bigger in those areas. And again, that medullary cone, or I learned it as conus medullaris, is where the cord kind of tapers to a point, just inferior to that lumbar enlargement. And again, on page 473 is a nice picture there showing you. And then the cauda equinal is these nerve roots that go from L2 all the way down to S5 in the vertebral canals that are going out those places. Here's some pictures. You can see, just running right down the middle here, the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. The enlargements, the conus medullaris, or the medullary cone, and the cauda equina. And here's the picture that you have in your textbook. The spinal cord is covered by these things called the meninges. And every time I think of meninges, I think of my dean at Andrews. His name was Dean Menges. So I always think that whenever I talk about this thing, I don't think he's alive still. He was pretty old when I was there. Anyway, good guy. Hello, Dean Menges, if you're listening. Why he would be, I don't know, but we'll say hello. Okay? So this is kind of our cross-sectional view of the spinal cord in suti, like actually in the body itself. And there are these three layers of these meninges. The meninges are these fibrous coverings that separate the nervous tissue from the bone tissue. Again, think about the Amazon packaging, right? That I just bought this little flash drive, but that flash drive is wrapped, and then that's in this box, it's wrapped, and this is wrapped, right? Same kind of deal with the spinal cord. It's protection, right? We're keeping it safe. The outermost layer is what we call the dura mater. And the dura mater is, they called it, it's thick like a rubber glove. Maybe do any of your mothers or grandmothers use those rubber gloves when they wash dishes? Yeah. My wife's mother is a big rubber glove lady when she washes her dishes, right? So she's got these sweet purple ones even, pretty impressive, right? She likes purple. So it's about that thickness and that toughness as well. And again, this is the place that's protecting this outer layer of the spinal cord. Have you ever heard of an epidural injection? Yeah. So for ladies, oftentimes when you're having a baby, this is one way that you can relieve some of those pains is by getting an epidural injection. This is where they're actually putting the needle down into this dura and inserting that medicine that numbs basically below that place. Does that make sense? So an epidural goes there in the dura mater. The next, oh sir. Yeah. So you really can't feel it. So the points on the back of our spine here, that's these guys here. And you've got this kind of arch, we call it the laminas, that are all around the spine. So you can't just come and poke and feel your spinal cord. In order for them to actually put this injection, you basically have to bend over this table. You lean over the table that opens up one of these little areas, and they put the needle down. So it's down there pretty good. It's pretty well protected, thankfully, right? Because it's controlling everything. So yeah, it's pretty deep inside there. Our second layer of the three meninges is what we call the arachnoid layer. Arachnoid meaning spiders, right? So this is a very web-like kind of covering. And between the arachnoid and the next layer, which is called the pia mater, is what we call the subarachnoid space. And in that subarachnoid space, it contains the cerebral spinal fluid. Remember, this is the fluid that is filling the spaces in your brain and bathes the whole spinal cord all the way down. And it flows through these areas. Has anybody ever heard of meningitis? Sure, meningitis is inflammation of the what? Meninges, right? So that means there is an infection that has gotten into this cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, because that's usually the layer that we're dealing with, is in the subarachnoid space. It can be bacterial, which can kill you. Virus, which is not as bad, but can still be an issue. Bacterial meningitis can be like you'll be dead in 2 days, kind of thing. It's a really big deal. You know it by neck stiffness. It's one of those kind of key pieces. Very quickly, you've gotten this neck stiffness and you get a temperature that goes up. Make sure you check somebody out. The temperature piece is a big piece. Not just, oh, my neck hurts, I'm going to die of meningitis. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. Yes? It's just an infection. It's an infection that has somehow concentrated itself in this area. You know what? I think that you're right. I think that they have been doing a meningital bacterial meningitis vaccination. I think you're correct. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think you're right.
It's not like contagious like
I think that cerebrospinal fluid is contained enough that like it's not going to be in your mucus or in your sneezes or things. I'm not entirely positive though. I'm not sure. We could check. That would be a good one to look up. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's certainly a very water-based. There are proteins that are there. There are nutrients certainly because it's bringing nutrients to these different neurons as it's moving through. If you want to look it up and let me know, I'd be glad to remember. We haven't talked about that piece yet, so I don't remember. It's been too long. Sorry? Okay, good. Thank you. You guys are giving me the lookups right away. I appreciate that. The last but not least, the third layer of the meninges is the pia. And this is a very thin layer right on top of the spinal cord. Very delicate, very thin, that pia mater. And it's the most deep. So if I'm going from superficial to deep, what would be the most superficial of the meninges? The dura, and then arachnoid, and then the deepest would be the pia. You will see that again. Okay, you'll see that again. The next piece, when we move into kind of this cross-sectional view, and here's another beautiful spot where you can see, here is the pia, the pink stuff, the arachnoid, the whitey, and the dura, the outside, thicker one. Make sense? And again, that surrounds the whole entire spinal cord. We continue on. I want to mention spinal bifida. This is one of the conditions. By the way, if you look on the back, because we had a little bit more opportunity to do this, I included some conditions, some clinical things that we see with difficulties with the spinal cord. And the first one is spinal bifida. And the key piece with spinal bifida is this arch that surrounds the spinal cord doesn't fully grow together in this baby. And so then what happens is you get basically a leakage. And when I say leakage, not like water, but like actual tissue that starts coming out of that area. And at its worst, you get this spinal bifida cystica, where that fluid actually forms this big cyst on the back. So this is a cyst that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This is dura mater, basically, that is being filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. Are you comfortable that would be a slight problem? Yeah. Okay, so that would be something you'd have to get repaired immediately within the first couple of days of the baby being born. I suppose it could. Right, it wouldn't be usually would not be a cyst of cerebrospinal fluid like this. That really is a congenital defect, that the actual vertebrae are not growing the right way. Does that make sense? But you can certainly get other cysts that would look something like that, absolutely, sure.
How would you fix
So I would assume that they would have to in some way either add bone. Again, I'm not a surgeon, so you're outside of my expertise. But I would assume that they would in some way shape the bone that's present or add some other bone from another place to, again, make that arch and close in that spinal cord.
But how would they fix, so like that would fix the problem, but how would they fix like the outcome? Yeah.
Right, sure. They'd have to cut that piece off and close the hole, basically.
It would still make it after a
Right. Right. Yeah, certainly. Folic acid is one of the B vitamins that we encourage all ladies to take if they think they're going to get pregnant, because they have found that a lack of this vitamin actually increases the risk of spinal bifida occurring. So the defect occurs during the first 4 weeks of development, and most ladies don't even know they're pregnant at that point, because it's usually the missing of your period that makes you say, oh boy, I must be pregnant. But that's already, the pregnancy's been already going on for a couple of weeks at that point, right? So if you know you're going to get pregnant, they encourage you, hey, start these supplements months beforehand so you have a buildup and an excess of that folic acid, so you're not worried about that. Well, I know none of you are thinking about that currently, at least I certainly hope not. All right, moving on to the cross-sectional anatomy. What I want you to be comfortable about the cross-sectional anatomy, is that not the same picture? I guess I just moved it down. Okay. Is that you have gray matter and you have white matter when we look closely at this spinal cord. So the gray matter is this inside part right here. And what did we say? What kind of neurons make up the gray matter? The unmyelinated. And by the way, your textbook talked about why they call it gray versus white. Historically, spinal cords were stained. Are you comfortable anytime we look at a slide, you have to put some sort of stain? Remember when we did our cheek cells and we had to stain them with that blue stain to actually be able to see them? The same thing, and spinal cord tissue was historically stained with a silver compound that caused the unmyelinated to be grayer and the myelinated to be white, and so that's why they got their names. Does that make sense? Even though they're really not white and gray. Okay, that's where these names came from. So the gray matter is your unmyelinated neurons, and it kind of looks like a butterfly, doesn't it? In the middle there, that's just a classic shape. And if you looked even on the spinal cord we had back in the on the microscope with the wide lens, you could see that very clearly, this kind of butterfly shape. In the middle of that gray matter is the central canal. It is, the older you get, this kind of goes away. It kind of just collapses in on itself and fills in with neurons. But if there is that pleasant, it is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And the white matter is around it. That white matter would be the myelinated neurons. And that does surround the gray matter. These little pieces here they call horns. The anterior and the posterior horns. I'm not interested in you knowing. There's a lot of terminology I'm sure you've seen as you read that we're kind of moving past. It's all right. Lots of always more things to learn. Always more things to get to. The next piece I want to talk about are these tracts, these ascending and descending tracts, the spinal tracts. So an ascending tract, what kind of information do you think that's going to carry? Sensory, which makes sense. I'm feeling stuff with my hands, it's got to come up to my brain, right? So it's ascending. If I'm having a signal going from the brain back down to my hands, that's going to be my motor signal, so therefore which tract is that going to be on? The descending. Does that make sense? And I want to point out to you that there are tons of these different tracts. And this is the piece where I had to make some decisions, because if we were to dive into these different tracts, I mean, it's a lot of pieces. A lot of things to jump into. I just didn't think we had time to do that. Understand that in my graduate school, in my neurology class, we had to learn all of these different tracks. Whether they crossed over or not. Here in this study guide, it talks about the fact that some of the tracks undergo desiccation, which again is just crossing over from one side to the other. That's why if I have a brain injury on the left side of my body, the left side of my brain, it's the right side of my body that's affected because of this crossing over of these spinal tracts. Not all of them do, but many of them do. But I chose, we're not going to jump into those pieces, all of them. So, but you can see this is a very typical view. This view is here on page 478. And this is showing you some of the specific pathways moving up through the spinal cord. So for example, in A is the cunate fasciculus, and the B is the spinothalamic tract. And they're basically just showing you from the bottom, here's where the information comes into the spinal cord. Here it goes moving up the spinal cord into the medulla, and then the midbrain, and then the cerebrum. These are all parts of the brain, which we'll learn more about in the next chapter. But there are very specific places where these tracks go. And again, for all 20 of them, about 20 different tracks, they've mapped basically where each one of them goes and what they control.
So if the swapping of your brain, like right to both left, is affected by the crossing over, why does it cross over to begin with?
I don't know if there's a good answer for that question. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I would imagine it has to do something developmentally that has caused these areas to move, maybe based upon the fact that the tissue started in one place and then migrated and moved other places as you grew. But I honestly don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are lovely tables in your textbook. I'm talking about specifically page 477. There's the major ascending and descending tracks. They talk through on pages 478 to 480, basically, these different ascending and descending pathways. I'm just wanting you to be aware of it, okay? Like I said, I'm being purposeful in choosing not to dive into the significant details of these guys because I think it would just overwhelm you, David. But, all right? Not David personally, but just us as a group. Did I miss anything from there? Again, each tract carries specific information to specific areas of the brain and the body. Let's talk about poliomyelitis. Since we're just rolling along, over there on page 481, you see that picture of Stephen Hawking, who this textbook was published before he died, so he did just die recently. He suffered from ALS, so let me pop down to ALS since I'm talking about him. In my humble opinion, this is the absolute worst way to die. Okay, maybe if you were to get severely burned but not actually dying, and you have to live and recover from that. But ALS, I think, is the absolute worst. Why? ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, basically the motor neurons start breaking down. And so basically, very slowly, you become paralyzed. And it usually goes from the hands and feet moving upward toward your brain. Okay? So you start by, you're just a little clumsy, you're tripping, and then you can't quite open jars or something. And slowly, slowly, this completely saps you until you can't actually move at all. How do they die? Is usually because they can't breathe. Right? And that's terrible enough. But the worst part is your brain is completely unaffected. So you have complete awareness, complete consciousness, your thinking process is unaffected at all because it's simply a motor problem. Does that make sense? So that's why Stephen Hawking is such an amazing example. His body, was broken. He was in horrible shape physically, right? But mentally, he was a giant as far as physics goes, right? He went to Cambridge University, and he was in his 20s when they diagnosed him with ALS. And again, he was just a normal guy, who was brilliant, but doing normal things, and then gradually this life of, to the point where he couldn't even speak, right? I'm sure you all have heard the Stephen Hawking voice, right? This was just a computer that he would type, and at the end, it was simply he was using his eyes to move. It's craziness how they can do this, to speak. And this was one of the first ones that came out, and it kind of just became associated with Stephen Hawking. So they had other voices he could have picked that would have been closer to his own, but no, this was his voice now, he would actually use his mouth, or even at the end, he was using eye movements, because that was all he could control. Yeah. Or to choose phrases. Very difficult. If you ever watched any interviews with him, they would give him the questions beforehand, and then it would kind of be pre-programmed in. Does that make sense? He would answer them, but not while the person's sitting there waiting, because it would take too long. But I mean, he lectured. He was like a teacher for years and years in a wheelchair, right? Where for a while he tried to speak, and there was a student who was kind of interpreting, and writing on the board and things. But then it got to the point where he couldn't even do that. What's the movie that's about him? Can anybody remember? It's very solid. I can't remember the name of it. It's not, again, it's Hollywooded, but Eddie Raimier, or I can't remember how to pronounce it. He's the one who played and did a fantastic job. Anyway, one of you will find it. What's that? The Theory of Everything. Is that what it's called? The movie? Okay. Yeah. Well done. Very well done. Look at his life. Polio, on the other hand, polio is a disease that your parents or your grandparents, maybe your parents are too young, because I'm your parents, your grandparents, this was in the early 20s, 30s, this was the most feared disease that there was. Because again, polio is caused by a virus, the polio virus, and it again destroys these motor neurons. And so you would have people who would be completely paralyzed from this vaccine, or from this virus, right? And it was spread by contaminated water, and you had to go into these, they called them iron lungs, because again, the diaphragm would become paralyzed. You couldn't breathe. And so they had these machines that basically breathed for you to allow the person to live. Yeah, quite the story. Now, we have a vaccine for this now, that as long as you're vaccinated, there's no issues. But this is one of those diseases that's starting to crop up again because people think that vaccines are bad. And I say that with complete love. The research shows vaccines are not harmful. They do not cause autism. Right, because the folks aren't being vaccinated. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, no, the viruses are still out there. The vaccinations keep us from being affected. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. I've told you the story about the vaccines, right? Yeah. About the doctor. One study, and I'm super fast. The main thing that got everybody interested in the fact that vaccines are a problem. There was one study in a British medical journal that this guy looked at. I think it was about 25 or 26 kids. And there was a higher percentage of them that if they had gotten this vaccine, they developed autism. Okay? When they went back to the study, the guy had totally made up his results. They tried to reproduce this over larger populations. Because are you comfortable that with 25 people you can find just about anything? Super randomly? Take a much larger group of people. This has been literally researched almost into the ground. And they find no connection between vaccines and autism. Now, why do people think it is the case? And I understand why. Because you get a vaccine, and then not too long after that, you develop autism. Right? But just because one came first doesn't mean it caused the second thing. Does that make sense? It's a very typical fallacy in logic. If this happened first, it must have caused the second thing. But again, they've showed consistently, no, there's no connection between them. Sure, I had this vaccine and now I have autism. But did that vaccine cause the autism? We have not found anything that shows that to be the case. Does that make sense? I drove to school this morning, and then it started raining.
You caused the rain?
Did I?
Yeah.
I mean, it came after. Does that make sense? That's a different example. But does that make sense? Just because something happens afterward doesn't mean the thing that came first caused it.
So is there any known cause for
No, this is again one of the difficult pieces, is we don't have a solid ideal, boom, this causes it. So again, folks say, oh, well, let's be protective, right? Maybe it is the vaccines. But the difficulties are that we're causing more problems from that piece. Whew, sorry, I can get on my horse about this one, because it really, really bothers me that people like you, again, kids are the ones who deal with these decisions, right? It's not the parents who have to deal with it. All right, let's talk about these spinal nerves. This is here on page 482. Our spinal nerves, right? These are nerves that come from the spinal cord. And don't you say, well, wait, Mr. Hess, doesn't every nerve come from the spinal cord? No. Where else do nerves come from? Does anybody remember? The brain. Like literally straight from the brain, they come out. We call these cranial nerves. We'll learn all about those coming up. There are 12 of them that we will learn in good detail what they do. But we'll get to those. The spinal nerves that we're talking about today. Excuse me. And you can see that the spinal nerves are basically this cord-like organ that's got numerous nerve fibers or axons that are all bound together, just like our muscles. Remember, you've got muscle fibers that then are put into fascicles, and those fascicles are grouped together to make muscles. Same kind of deal with these nerves. The nerves are a bunch of axons that are put together. Nerves can have a couple of different flavors to them. Sure, yeah. They can be sensory, they can be motor, or they can be mixed. You know, you got the twist kind of nerves. And that will be both sensory and motor. And the cranial nerves work the same way. Some of them are purely sensory, some are purely motor. Many of them are mixed, this combination of the two pieces. The nerves, of course, everything is wrapped in lots of pieces, right? So you have the endoneurium and the perineurium and the epineurium. Do you remember this from the muscles too? Right? Endomyosin, perimyosin, epimyosin. Same thing. This is just what wraps the nerves. I don't. I don't know what's here. But I'm just pointing it out to you. Same prefixes even, right? That endo is the inner one, the peri is the middle one, the epi is the outer one. Same pieces. Good. Let's keep going. There are those little ganglions. What are in the ganglions again? The nerve somas, the cell bodies, right? And the somas, of course, are the things that actually control the neuron, right? We good? The cell bodies, the nucleus is in there. So it's what's doing all the control of those pieces. Spinal nerves, you got 31 pairs of these nerves. And these are mixed. Your spinal nerves are all mixed. They're going to be both sensory and motor. We've got 8 cervicals. And that's because the first cervical nerve exits between the skull and the atlas. So it's like the skull and C1, and then C1, C2, C2, C3, C3, C4, etc., etc. So there's 8 cervicals. 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal, though again, these nerves on the bottom, they don't always come out just like that. Here's some zoomed in pieces that we can see those nerves coming out. The yellow pieces they've highlighted are just simply those cranial nerves where they're coming out of the spinal cord. A nice view, again, cross-sectionally looking at the spinal cord with the dorsal and the ventral roots that are coming out, which we'll talk about those in just a moment. I think that's actually where I'm going to end here, is talking about these roots. So, again, looking at a cross-section, we have dorsal, which dorsal means which way, friends? Anterior or posterior? Posterior is dorsal, right? So the dorsal roots come in the back side, and the ventral roots come in the front side. And again, there's a lovely picture of this in your textbook. Well, I guess there's lots of them actually. But you can see it well on 482. You can see it well in 485, where these roots are coming in. So the anterior, the ventral roots carry the motor nerves. the motor neurons. The posterior root contains the sensory neurons. So, imagine for a moment, here's your spine, right? And you have a disc. Remember, the discs are between each of the vertebrae. And that disc develops a herniation, a little push out of the disc, right? And that herniation comes and it moves posteriorly and pushes on that dorsal nerve root. What do you think is going to be affected? Well, what does that dorsal root carry? The sensory neurons. So if it's pushing there, let's say at L2, then the L2 area where the L2 brings sensory to will be affected. Does that make sense? We'll talk more about dermatomes in a moment, or tomorrow actually. What if it herniated anteriorly? Then it's going to push on that anterior nerve root, and what will be affected then? The motor control. So therefore the muscles that are innervated by L2 would not be able to work as well. And as a physician or a physical therapist or any medical personnel, you could test that. Because different muscles go to different nerves, and we can see how that works. Does that make sense? And that's because into the spinal cord, they come in opposite sides. Again, the posterior dorsal side is where the sensory comes, and the anterior is going to be where you get the motor. Question? Sure, there's a lot of stuff outside of surgery we can do to help that person. Because like I mentioned yesterday, if we were to take an MRI of all your guys' back, those of you who don't have any back pain, we would find some herniations, right, where those discs are pushing out. It happens. Maybe not for you all, you're fairly young, but certainly somebody like me, though I do have back pain, so it doesn't count. Okay? But it is not, so it's not necessarily just the fact that there's a herniation that's the problem, and there has to be inflammation. There has to be weakness around that's causing this to continually be inflamed. So we can address those pieces. You address the inflammation, you address the weakness, you address the posture, that's a huge one. You can improve that, certainly, without having to do surgery. Yeah. Sure. An inversion table, you basically put these strap pieces on your heels and you flip upside down. What's the point of that? It elongates the spine and takes the pressure off of those nerves. Yeah. Yeah. Some of those people, it works fantastically. It doesn't make you taller, by the way. Sorry. If you're trying to get taller, it won't help. Sure, initially, but then as soon as you stand the right side up, gravity pushes you back down again. I'm talking about like permanent tallerness. Yeah. 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 For their necks. Sure. Sure. Just by this continual forward motion, you're putting pressure on the anterior part of those discs, and you're pushing it. So I always thought of a disc. How one of my professors told me a disc was like a jelly-filled donut, or like a cream-filled donut, right? Because it has a thicker outside with kind of this squishiness on the inside. Okay? So if I continually push on the front end of a donut, what's going to happen? It's going to squirt the stuff to the backside. Now, it's not exactly like that. It's much stronger than a donut, okay? But that's the point. If I continually am looking downward, I'm putting pressure on that anterior side of the disc. It's going to push the other pieces posteriorly, and eventually those could rupture and come out. Yeah, it's absolutely correct. The same thing when we sit like this.
Oh no, I have really bad posture.
Right? Again, I'm putting all the pressure on the anterior part of my spine, right? Versus when I do this, now it's going straight up and down.
Well, that's why your back hurts.
That's why your back hurts. Absolutely. 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 And everybody quickly sits up nice and tall. It's good. Sure. your body is meant to go through its whole range of motion consistently. So yes, we want to make sure we're doing these full extensions. We're doing flexions, we're doing side bendings, we're doing rotations. Our difficulty is we tend to be sitting or standing once in a while, but then sitting again. What's the best movement? All of them. That's really the best thing I can say. There isn't one. If you do repetitively one something, your body will break down. Does that make sense? It needs to go through. This is one of the big things. Yoga has become such a big thing the last 5 or 6 years. And one of the reasons why is they're very purposeful about taking you through a full range of motion of a joint. There's some good things to it. I'm not talking about the Eastern religion piece to it, but exercise-wise, there's some very solid pieces to it. Yeah. Okay, excuse me. We're going to stop there, and we'll continue on. Just a little bit left, right? Not too much more to discuss, which I like.